The first time I noticed him, I told myself it was nothing. That's what you do, isn't it? You explain things away. You smooth the edges of something strange until it fits into the shape of something ordinary. The mind is generous like that, protective, almost motherly in the way it insists on keeping you comfortable. He's just a regular guy. He's just sitting there. People sit in coffee shops all the time. And he was just sitting there. Corner table. Back to the wall, which was the first thing I clocked, because I always sit with my back to the wall too. And the corner was my spot, the one I'd claimed every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the past 14 months at Groundwork Coffee on Belmont Avenue. Not aggressively claimed. I never said anything to anyone. But creatures of habit leave invisible marks on the places they return to. And I had pressed myself into that corner so many times that the staff knew my order before I opened my mouth. And the chair's left armrest had a small groove where I always rested my thumb while I worked. He was in the other corner, not my chair. Enough distance that there was nothing technically strange about it. I noticed him the way I notice everything, quietly and all at once. That's the thing about spinning your career inside sound. You start to perceive the world in layers. Most people hear a city the way they watch a film. They absorb the surface of it without separating the tracks. I hear it differently. I hear the hum beneath the hum, the held breath inside the crowd noise, the specific weight of a silence that has something in it versus a silence that is simply empty. He was the something inside a silence. His coffee sat in front of him, barely touched. He had no laptop, no book, no phone in his hand. He was just present, in the specific, deliberate way that most people in public spaces never are. We are all so beautifully distracted now, so continuously somewhere else, that a man who is simply here, watching the room with quiet eyes and no performance of productivity, that man becomes strange by default. I looked at him for 3 seconds. He didn't look back. I opened my laptop and went to work. I'm a freelance sound designer, mostly post-production, film, short-form content, the occasional video game project when the budget is right. It's solitary work that sounds more glamorous than it is. In practice, it means I spend a lot of hours alone in my apartment or in rented studio time, listening to things that other people recorded, reshaping them into something that feels emotionally true. Footsteps that land with the right weight. Ambient noise that makes a hallway feel abandoned versus just quiet. The difference between rain that comforts and rain that threatens. Sound is manipulative by nature. I've always found that interesting. The same image, a man walking toward a door, becomes completely different depending on what you put underneath it. Low strings and you're afraid. A single piano note and you're heartbroken. Silence and you're terrified, because silence in the wrong context is the loudest thing in the world. I work with silence more than anything else. My mother used to say I was too quiet for a person, that I moved through rooms like I was worried about disturbing something. She meant it as gentle criticism. Open up, Noah, let people in, but I always thought she had it slightly wrong. It wasn't that I was afraid of disturbing things. It was that I was always listening first, mapping the room before I committed to being in it. It made me good at my job. It made me a little hard to know. I worked until noon. When I looked up to rest my eyes, the corner table was empty. His cup was gone. The chair was pushed in neatly. I don't know why I noticed that the chair was pushed in. Most people don't push chairs in when they leave. I filed it away in the part of my brain where I keep small, useless observations, finished my coffee, and walked home. The second time was a Thursday. Same corner. Same untouched cup, this time something darker. Espresso maybe, or Americano. He was wearing different clothes, but had the same quality of stillness. Like someone had pressed pause on him, and only his eyes were still running. He was looking toward the window when I walked in, and I had the brief, irrational sense that he had been watching the door. I took my seat, set up my laptop, did not look at him again for 40 minutes. When I finally did, he was looking at me. Not the quick, reflexive glance that people exchange and look away from. He was looking at me the way I look at a recording when something is slightly off and I can't locate the source yet. patient, specific, like I was something he was in the middle of figuring out. I held his gaze for 2 seconds. 3. He didn't look away. I did. My heart was doing something irregular. Not fear. I want to be honest about that, because fear would have been the correct response, and I have always been a little suspicious of my own responses. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to the feeling I get when a sound design comes together in a way I didn't plan, when something clicks into a shape that is better than what I intended. Unexpected recognition. There you are, that feeling says. I didn't know I was looking for you. I packed up at my usual time, nodded at the barista, and left. I didn't look at his corner again on the way out. I was proud of myself for that. All the way home, I told myself that was the right choice. Normal. Healthy. A completely reasonable response to a stranger who stared a beat too long. By the time I reached my apartment building and pressed the elevator button, I had already decided I would sit somewhere different on Tuesday. I never did. He knew my name before I ever told him. Tuesday came and I sat in my corner. I didn't examine the decision too closely. That's another thing I've learned about myself over the years. When I start to over-examine a choice, it usually means some quieter, more honest part of me has already made it. And the examination is just noise I'm generating to feel like I had control. I sat in my corner because I wanted to. Because the alternative was letting a stranger with steady eyes rearrange my routine, and something in me, that folded, tucked away part, refused to give him that. He wasn't there when I arrived. I noticed that too. The absence of him had a texture, which was already more than I should have been giving a man I had never spoken to. I ordered my usual, settled into my chair, opened my laptop, and told myself the mild deflation I felt was simply the disruption of a pattern. Nothing more. I worked for an hour. The door opened at 9:47. I know because I had just glanced at the clock in the corner of my screen to check how long I'd been on a particular audio sequence. I didn't look up. I registered the sound of the door the way I register everything, passively, laying it into the background track of the morning without assigning it meaning. But then I heard the chair, the specific drag of it across tile. Light. Careful. The corner table. I kept my eyes on my screen for another 4 minutes. Then I reached for my coffee cup, and in the natural arc of that movement, I looked up. He was already looking at me. This time I didn't look away. I don't know what made the difference. Maybe I was tired of being the one who blinked first. Maybe that quieter part of me had gotten impatient. I looked back at him with the same steadiness he gave me, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not surprise. More like confirmation. Like I had just answered a question he'd been holding for a while. He picked up his cup, stood up, and walked toward me. My pulse did something embarrassing. I set my coffee down carefully so it wouldn't show in my hands, and I watched him close the distance between our tables with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent a long time making sure they don't disturb things. He moved like he knew the exact amount of space his body occupied and had made peace with it. No wasted motion. No performance. He stopped at the edge of my table and looked down at me, and up close he was, different than I expected, though I couldn't have told you what I expected. He was tall, but not imposing. His face was angular, a little worn at the edges, the kind of face that had been through something and come out the other side, not quite the same shape. His eyes were a pale, serious gray, and there were faint shadows beneath them that suggested either insomnia or something heavier. He said, "You changed your schedule." His voice was low, measured, an American accent with something European underneath it, softened by years, but still there, a ghost of somewhere else. I looked up at him. "Sorry, last week you came Thursday. This week you came Tuesday." A brief pause. "You usually come both days." The air in the room didn't change. The coffee shop noise continued. Milk steaming, someone laughing at the counter, the low bleat of music from the speakers. Everything carried on exactly as it was. And yet something had just moved, tectonic and silent, beneath the surface of the morning. "You usually come both days." I kept my face still. It took effort. "You've been paying attention." Yes, he said, simply, without apology or performance. Most people, when caught doing something that requires explanation, will immediately start explaining. They'll reach for humor or deflection or the nearest socially acceptable cover story. He did none of those things. He just stood there and confirmed it, like it was a reasonable thing to admit to a stranger, like paying careful attention to someone you'd never spoken to was simply a fact of the world. He had no interest in dressing up. I should have been unsettled. I filed that shit away for later and said, "Is there something I can help you with?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. I just wanted to introduce myself. He pulled out the chair across from me, not asking, but pausing a beat in a way that functioned like a question. I didn't say no. He sat down. "Elias." "Noah," I said. And then the world went very quiet. Not the room. The room was exactly the same. But something in my internal audio dropped out completely, the way it does in the half second before a sound you weren't expecting arrives. Because he hadn't reacted to my name. There was no small repetition of it. No Noah. Nice to meet you. None of the social performance that follows an introduction. He received it with a stillness that was too complete, too settled. Like it wasn't new information. "Noah," he said after a moment, as though he was simply deciding how it sounded out loud. I watched him. "You already knew that." It wasn't a question. I heard the certainty in my own voice and was mildly surprised by it. That folded dark thing in me leaning forward, just slightly, pressing its hands flat against the inside of my ribs. He looked at me for a long moment. Those pale gray eyes doing that patient, locating thing, the thing that had bothered me across a coffee shop for 2 weeks, and bothered me considerably more now that it was happening from 3 feet away. "Yes," he said again. One word. Same flatness. Same complete absence of apology. I breathed in through my nose. Breathed out slowly. In my chest something was pulling tight, and I recognized it distantly as the feeling I get when I'm handed an audio project with a flaw buried deep in it. Something that doesn't announce itself, but that I can sense the way you sense a room is wrong before you can name why. It was the feeling of a problem that is also, somehow, interesting. That is going to require my full attention, that I do not actually want to hand back. "Okay," I said. He tilted his head slightly. "Okay. Okay," I repeated. "You knew my name before I told you. You've been watching my schedule." I folded my hands on the table in front of me, very calm, the way my mother taught me to sit when I was angry and needed to not look it. "I'm going to need more than a first name, Elias." Something changed in his face then. Subtle and real in a way his expressions hadn't been before, like a layer had shifted and something underneath briefly surfaced. Not softness, exactly. More like recognition. The same "there you are" quality I had felt looking at him, reflected back at me in his gray eyes. "You're not afraid," he said. It sounded less like an observation and more like something he was processing out loud. Should I be? He considered that with the same seriousness he seemed to apply to everything. Most people would be. I'm not most people. The almost smile came back. Slightly more this time. "No," he said quietly. "You're not." We sat with that for a moment. The coffee shop carried on around us, indifferent and warm, completely unaware that something had just been established between two people at a corner table that neither of them would be able to walk back from. He stood up the same way he'd sat down, without announcement, no farewell performance. He pushed his chair in, picked up his cup. Then he paused with his back half turned to me and said, without looking around, "Thursday. Same time." Not a question, not quite an invitation either. Something in between, the kind of statement that only makes sense if you already know the answer. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. He left. The door opened. A cold thread of outside air moved through the room, and then the door closed, and the sound of the city disappeared again, and I sat in my corner with my hands still folded on the table and my heart running just slightly too fast, staring at the door for a long time after he was gone. I reached for my laptop, opened the audio sequence I'd been working on before he walked over. I didn't hear a single thing I was supposed to be listening to. I was still thinking about the way he'd said yes, twice, plainly, without flinching, when I should have been afraid and wasn't, and couldn't figure out if that said something about him or something about me that I'd been avoiding looking at for a very long time. Thursday, I thought. Same time. I closed my laptop at noon, packed up my bag, and walked home in the gray October cold with the strange, floating feeling of someone who has just agreed to something without using any words. He knew my name before I ever told him. Thursday came the way things do when you've been waiting for them, too slowly and then all at once. I spent Wednesday pretending I wasn't thinking about it. I took a long studio session in the afternoon, 3 hours buried in the sound design for a short film a director friend had sent over. A quiet psychological piece about a woman who starts hearing sounds in her apartment that no one else can hear. The irony of the project was not lost on me. I sat in the dark with my headphones on, layering frequencies, building the particular texture of dread that the director wanted, and tried very hard not to think about gray eyes and a voice that delivered uncomfortable truths like they were simply the weather. I mostly failed. The sounds kept pulling me back. That's the thing about working in audio. Your brain doesn't stop processing, even when you want it to. I'd be 3 minutes deep into a sound bed, and something would surface. The specific drag of his chair across tile. The way his voice had that buried European undertone, worn smooth but still there. The complete, undefended stillness of him when he said yes. Not the yes of someone confessing, but the yes of someone stating a coordinate. This is where I am. This is what I'm doing. I won't dress it up for you. I finished the session, invoiced the director, ate something I don't remember, and went to bed. I was at groundwork by 9:40 Thursday morning. He was already there. Same corner. Same stillness. This time his cup was something with foam. Cappuccino maybe. A small concession to something human. He was looking at the door when I walked in, and I held his gaze as I crossed the room to the counter, ordered, and carried my coffee to my table without stopping at his. The morning opened up around us like it always did. I worked. He sat. But something had shifted in the architecture of it. Before Tuesday, the watching had been something I observed from a comfortable distance, a strange feature of the room I could file under inexplicable but manageable. Now there was a name attached to it, a voice, a chair pushed in neatly, and a Thursday, same time delivered to the air between us like a standing invitation I had silently accepted. The distance between our tables was the same 20 feet it had always been. It felt considerably shorter. At 10:15 he got up and left without coming over. I stared at the corner table for a full minute after he was gone. I didn't know what I'd expected. Another conversation, maybe. Another careful exchange of plain truths. Something to move the thing forward, whatever the thing was. Instead, he had simply been there, shown up the way he said he would, and then left without making anything of it. And I sat with the strange, slightly indignant feeling of someone who had prepared for a test that didn't come, which told me something I stored carefully away, that I had prepared, that some part of me had spent 2 days getting ready for him, and he had come and gone like a tide that didn't need my permission. I closed my laptop, finished my coffee, and walked home already recalculating. The next 2 weeks moved differently. He was there on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always before me, always in the corner. Sometimes he came over. Sometimes he didn't. There was no discernible pattern to it that I could identify, and I tried. Believe me, I tried. I ran the variables in my head the way I run a problematic audio mix. Is it when I arrive first? Is it when the shop is below a certain noise threshold? Is it connected to what I'm working on, the expression on my face, the color of what I'm wearing? Nothing held. He operated on a logic I couldn't map, and the not knowing made me more alert, not less. Like a sound just below the threshold of hearing that you keep turning your head toward. When he did come over, the conversations were strange and specific. He asked me once what I was working on. I told him about the short film, The Woman and Her Apartment Sounds. He listened with that full, serious attention of his, and then said, "What makes a sound frightening versus just unexpected?" I thought about it honestly. Context, I said, and silence before it. The space you leave before something arrives is what determines how it lands. He looked at me for a moment. That's true of more than sound. I didn't answer that. We both let it sit between us, and I noticed he didn't seem to need me to fill the silence. He was comfortable in it the way I was, which was unusual enough that I noted it. Most people treat silence like a small emergency. Another time he sat down without preamble and said, "Do you have family here?" It was blunt enough that I looked up from my screen. In the city? In general. My mother's in Seattle. Father's not in the picture. No siblings. I paused. Why? I'm trying to understand your life, he said. Like that was a completely reasonable project for a person to have. And if I asked you the same question? Something closed slightly in his face. Not hostility. More like a door easing shut on a room he wasn't ready to show. No family, he said. Not anymore. I didn't push. But I filed it. The not anymore. The specific weight of those two words. The fact that he'd answered at all when he could have deflected. He was giving me something. Carefully, in small pieces, the way you introduce a new frequency into a mix so gradually the listener doesn't notice until it's already part of the sound. I was doing the same thing. I knew it. I wasn't proud of how little that bothered me. It was on a Tuesday in the third week that I started pulling threads. I don't know exactly what moved me to do it that evening rather than any other. Maybe it was the way he'd watched me leave that morning. I'd caught his reflection in the glass door as I pushed it open, and he was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the patient, cataloging look. Something raw. Something that didn't have the same careful management over it. I'd thought about it the whole walk home. I made tea, sat down at my desk, and opened a new browser tab with the quiet, deliberate feeling of crossing a line I'd been standing at the edge of for days. Elias, German name, or at minimum Germanic, early 30s, American accent with European origin. The way he moved, that contained, space-aware economy, suggested training of some kind, the kind that doesn't leave the body even when you want it to. The way he sat with his back to walls. The way he registered every entrance and exit in a room without appearing to. The way he'd admitted to watching me without a molecule of social discomfort. These were not the features of an ordinary man. I searched broadly at first. Combinations of descriptors. Contractor work, intelligence adjacent, private security. Then I narrowed. I tried variations of the name against professional databases I had legitimate access to through a sound industry contact who occasionally did documentary work requiring background research tools. For 2 hours I found nothing, which was, in itself, a data point. Ordinary people leave traces. A LinkedIn profile, a business registration, a name in a local news piece, a college alumni page. The complete absence of a digital footprint is not the same as privacy. It's the deliberate shape of someone who has been removed or who removes themselves. Elias was not a ghost by accident. I leaned back from my screen, tea gone cold beside me, the city outside my window throwing its usual amber light across the ceiling. My pulse was steady. That was the thing I kept noticing, how steady I was. Most people, I think, discovering they'd been spending 3 weeks in gentle conversation with someone who didn't exist on paper would feel a particular species of fear, the kind that sends you to a different coffee shop. I felt something sharper than fear and significantly more dangerous. I felt interested, focused in the way I get when a sound design problem reveals itself to be more complex than the brief suggested, not frustrated, but alive to it. Leaning in, that folded, tucked away part of me had unfolded slightly, just at the edges. I pulled up a fresh document and began writing down everything I remembered. His word choices, his questions, and which ones he'd deflected. The European undertone, German, I was increasingly sure, or Austrian. The not anymore about family. The controlled way he occupied space. The single moment of unguarded expression I'd caught in the reflection of the door. I wrote for an hour. When I stopped, I had 2.5 pages of observations about a man whose last name I still didn't know, and the low, electric certainty that I had barely scratched the surface of what he was. More concerning, I had the distinct feeling he knew I was scratching, and hadn't tried to stop me. The following Thursday, he came to my table within 5 minutes of sitting down, which was unusual. He placed his cappuccino beside mine without asking, sat down, and looked at me with those pale gray eyes that I was beginning to dream about, which was a problem I was not yet ready to address. "You've been quiet this week," he said. "I've been thinking." "About?" I looked at him steadily. "About the fact that you don't exist anywhere I can find you." Something moved across his face. Still not surprise. He was past the point of being surprised by me, and I felt a complicated pride about that. "You looked," he said. "You knew I would." A pause. Yes. There was that word again, dropped plain and clean into the air between us. I had started to understand it as a specific kind of intimacy, the refusal to lie to me, even when the truth was a shape he wasn't ready to fill in completely. He would confirm. He would not yet explain. And the confirmation alone was more honesty than most people I'd known had managed in years. "Are you dangerous?" I asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. No. Not of course not. Not the reflexive reassurance that a person with nothing to hide would reach for automatically. "To you," he said finally. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." I looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a siren moved through the street, distant and then gone, swallowed by the city's ambient noise. The coffee shop murmured around us. Someone at the counter laughed. The ordinary world continued being ordinary, politely ignoring the fact that I was sitting across from a man who was not what he appeared and had somehow become the most interesting thing in my life. "Okay," I said. He looked at me. "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." This time the almost smile completed itself, briefly, incompletely, like a note played and then muted before it could fully ring out. It changed his face in a way that was difficult to look at directly, like something underneath the worn, careful surface becoming briefly visible, briefly real. He picked up his cup, drank, set it down. "I'll tell you something true on Tuesday," he said. I held his gaze. One thing. I nodded slowly. He stood, pushed his chair in, and left. And I sat in my corner with 2.5 pages of observations and the slowly hardening certainty that whatever Elias was carrying, whatever had brought him to my corner table with my name already in his mouth, it was connected to something in my own life that I had worked very deliberately to forget. The thought didn't frighten me. That was the part that should have. He knew my name before I ever told him. He said one thing. He gave me considerably more than that. Monday night, I didn't sleep well. I lay in the dark of my apartment listening to the city do what cities do. The distant percussion of a delivery truck, a couple arguing 2 floors up, the specific low-frequency hum of the building's heating system that I had long since mapped and cataloged and could no longer hear as noise, only as texture. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the phrase "I'll tell you something true" and what it implied about everything he'd said before it. Not that he'd lied. I didn't think he'd lied. But there is a significant geography between lying and telling the whole truth, and Elias had been living in that geography for weeks, giving me real things, confirmed things, while keeping the shape of the larger picture carefully out of frame. One thing he'd said, like he was rationing something that cost him. I thought about what I wanted the one thing to be. By 2 a.m., I had stopped pretending I was going to sleep and got up and made tea and stood at my kitchen window looking out at the street below. The neighborhood at this hour had a specific quality I'd always loved, emptied of its daytime performance. The buildings just buildings, the street just a street, everything stripped back to its structure. I had chosen this apartment partly for this view, partly for the way sound moved through it, the particular acoustic warmth of the high ceilings and the old plaster walls. I had chosen this neighborhood 5 years ago when I moved to this city. Coming from nowhere specific, putting distance between myself and a version of my life I had carefully disassembled and packed away. I was good at that, at folding things down until they took up no space, at building a new, clean routine over the top of something I preferred not to look at directly. I had not thought about that in a long time. I thought about it now. Tuesday, 9:43 a.m. He was there. Cappuccino. Corner table, back to the wall. He came over before I'd even opened my laptop, which told me he'd been waiting for this too, which I filed in the growing document of things that made my pulse do irregular things. He sat down. He looked at me. He said, without preamble, his name is Marcus Hale. I went very still. Not the stillness I perform when I want to appear calm. The other kind, the involuntary kind, the body making a decision before the mind catches up, every voluntary system suspending itself so that the deeper processing can happen uninterrupted. Marcus Hale. I hadn't heard that name in 4 years. I had worked hard not to. I had changed cities and changed my professional network and taken my mother off my public records and built this quiet, amber-lit life with my high ceilings and my corner table and my work that was only about listening and shaping sound and never about the things I'd walked away from. And in 5 seconds flat, 4 years of careful construction had a crack running straight through the middle of it. Say that again, I said. My voice came out level. I was distantly impressed. Marcus Hale, Elias repeated. Same plain delivery. Watching me with that full, serious attention. He hired me 8 weeks ago. The brief was observation only. Your movements, your routine, your contacts. Establishing whether you'd made communication with anyone from your previous. He paused, choosing the word carefully. Life. The coffee shop noise continued. Someone ordered a latte. The music from the speakers was something acoustic and soft and completely inappropriate for this moment. I looked at Elias across the small table and felt the thing inside my chest, that folded dark part, pressing outward slowly, the way pressure builds in a sealed room. You took a job watching me, I said. For Marcus Hale. Yes. And you're telling me this now because I told you I would tell you something true. A beat. And because it stopped being just a job approximately 3 weeks ago. I breathed in, breathed out, looked down at my hands on the table, still folded, still steady, my mother's training holding even now. How long have you been in contact with him? The contract was 8 weeks. I've submitted 2 progress reports. The last one was 3 weeks ago. What did it say? Something shifted in his jaw, the faintest tension. That your routine was consistent. That you showed no signs of active communication with prior associates. That continued observation was low yield. A pause. It was not a complete report. I looked up at him. What did you leave out? He held my gaze. You. The word landed differently than I expected. Not an admission, a fact. Delivered the same way he delivered everything. Plain and without armor. Except that this one had weight behind it that the others hadn't carried in quite the same way. He had omitted me from a report about me. He had looked at whatever Marcus Hale wanted to know about my life and made a choice, quietly and alone, to keep something back. I sat with that, turned it over, listened to what it sounded like underneath the surface. Who is Marcus Hale to you? I asked. Former employer. Occasionally a contractor relationship. He operates in private security and asset management, which is a phrase that covers a significant amount of ground. I know what it covers, I said. His eyes sharpened slightly. He didn't say anything, just let me feel the weight of what I'd revealed by knowing. And I felt the crack in my carefully constructed life spread another millimeter. I should explain Marcus Hale. I should explain the version of myself that knew him, and what that version was doing, and what it cost me when I decided to stop. I'll say what's necessary. For years ago, I was not only a sound designer. Sound design was the work I did and was good at and cared about, but I had made the mistake, at 24, underpaid, and significantly less wise than I understood myself to be, of becoming useful to people who needed someone with a careful, quiet skill set and no visible profile. Marcus Hale had interests in various acquisitions that required people who listened well and left no trace. I was good at placing audio, at finding the frequency of a room, identifying where information gathered and pooled. It was not innocent work. I don't tell myself it was. I stopped because of what I saw, not what I did. I won't claim clean hands entirely, but what I saw at the end of it, that I could not file away or fold down or smooth into something bearable. I left. I moved. I rebuilt. And I had lived for 4 years in the reasonable assumption that the distance was enough. Marcus Hale sending someone to watch me suggested the distance was not enough. Marcus Hale sending Elias suggested something more specific, more deliberate, that whatever he was monitoring for, he believed the risk was real enough to spend money on. And what Elias had just told me, that the last report was 3 weeks ago, that something had changed, meant the surveillance had shifted off its original axis. I looked at Elias. He'll send someone else when you stop reporting. He already has. Elias said it simply. Like this was information he had been holding in reserve, waiting to see if I needed it before offering it. There's been a second pair of eyes on you for approximately 10 days. Not mine. Someone I recognize from prior contract work, competent, careful. He's been at the corner of your block most mornings. The coffee shop tilted slightly. Not literally. My vestibular system was fine, but the version of the world I'd been living in tipped on its axis and realigned with a version I thought I'd escaped. And for a moment, the two overlapped uncomfortably, like a phase cancellation in audio, two waves meeting and hollowing each other out. You've been watching the person watching me, I said. Yes. For how long? Since I noticed him. 8 days. I pressed my hands flat on the table. Breathed carefully. The dark part of me had fully unfolded now. Not loudly. Not in the way that looks like rage from the outside, but in the quiet, methodical way of something that has been waiting a long time to be useful and has just been given permission. My thoughts arranged themselves with a precision that felt almost surgical. What does he want? I said. Specifically, what is Marcus looking for? Elias was quiet for a moment. This silence had a different quality to the others, heavier. With something underneath it, he was deciding whether to surface. The brief mention documentation, he said carefully. Records you may have retained from the period of your prior association. My stomach tightened. He thinks I kept something. He believes you may have. Given recent developments in certain cases, cases in which your former work is potentially adjacent to evidence that could be inconvenient for several parties, the concern has become active. Recent developments, I repeated. What cases? I don't have the full picture. He paused. I didn't want the full picture. Contracts like this, the less context you take on, the cleaner you stay. But you took this one. I took this one. He said it without elaboration, but he held my gaze in a way that was its own kind of sentence. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had come into my carefully rebuilt life carrying someone else's agenda and had somewhere in the middle of it made a choice. Quiet, unannounced, costly in ways I couldn't fully calculate yet, to step off that agenda and sit down at my table with the truth instead. I thought about trust, about how it's not a feeling, really, not for people like me. It's an assessment, a frequency you listen for, a resonance you test against the full spectrum of what you know, and either it holds or it doesn't. I listened to everything I knew about Elias. Every plain yes. Every door eased shut without being slammed. Every piece of himself offered carefully in small denominations, real, if not complete. It held. How long before the second watcher escalates? I said. Something moved in Elias's expression. Relief, I thought, though he wore it the way he wore everything else, compressed and controlled. He had been waiting to see what I would do with the truth, whether I would fold or recalibrate. I felt him land on his answer. A week, he said. Maybe less if Hale gets impatient. He's not a patient man. No, I agreed. He never was. Elias looked at me carefully. You're not running. No. Most people would. You said that before. I picked up my coffee, which had gone slightly cold, and drank it anyway. I'm starting to think you keep comparing me to most people because it surprises you that I'm not one. He almost smiled. Fuller this time, and it did the thing it always did to his face, briefly revealing the person underneath the contractor, underneath the worn, careful surface. Someone younger than his years suggested. Someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. It does surprise me, he said quietly. I set my cup down. Don't let it. I told you, I'm not most people. I met his eyes and let him see the part one usually kept folded. Just for a moment. Just enough. And I have no intention of running from this. He looked at me with those gray eyes, and I thought, not for the first time, that he saw me more completely than anyone I had let into my life in 4 years. That the watching, which should have been a violation, had instead become the most thorough act of attention I'd ever been given. Then we need to talk about what comes next, he said. Outside on the street, a cold wind moved through the October city, rattling the coffee shop windows in their frames. The second watcher was somewhere on my corner. Marcus Hale was somewhere making calculations about what I might have kept and what it was worth to him to retrieve it. And I was sitting in my corner with a broken man who had chosen me over his contract, feeling the most awake I had in 4 years. Yes, I said. One word. Plain and without apology. I watched something shift in his expression when I used it. Recognition, and something warmer underneath that neither of us named yet. We do. He knew my name before I ever told him. We didn't talk about it in the coffee shop. Elias made that decision with a single glance toward the window, brief, calibrated, the kind of look that belongs to people who have spent years reading environments for threat, and I understood it without needing it explained. The second watcher was outside. The coffee shop had glass walls on 2 sides. We were visible and stationary and had already been sitting together long enough that anyone paying attention would have logged it. I closed my laptop, packed my bag with the same unhurried movements I used every morning. Elias finished his coffee. We left separately, him first, me 2 minutes behind, which he communicated with the faintest tilt of his head toward the door and a look that said, "Give it time," as clearly as spoken language. I stood at the counter and ordered a second coffee I didn't want and watched the clock on my phone and felt the dark, methodical part of me running quiet calculations the whole time. The second watcher on my corner. The week Elias had estimated before escalation. The question of what Marcus Hale believed I had kept and what he intended to do about it. I thought about the small fireproof box at the back of my closet that I had not opened in 4 years. 2 minutes. I picked up my coffee and walked out. Elias was half a block north, moving at an unhurried pace that was calibrated to look like someone with nowhere particular to be. I fell into step approximately 20 feet behind him, which felt both absurd and completely natural, which told me something uncomfortable about what spending 5 weeks in his orbit had done to my instincts. We walked for 6 blocks. He turned into a narrow side street I'd passed 100 times without going down. The kind of street that exists in every old urban neighborhood. Too thin for traffic, lined with the backs of buildings and a single row of mature trees whose roots had broken through the pavement in long, patient heaves. He stopped at a door set into the side of a brick building, produced a key from his jacket pocket, and held the door open without looking back. I walked through it. The space inside was not what I expected, though I was running low on expectations that Elias hadn't already rearranged. It was a single large room on the building's ground floor, the kind that had once been commercial and been gradually converted into something in between. High ceilings, exposed pipe, a long work table against one wall covered in a precise arrangement of equipment I recognized partially, a laptop, 2 external hard drives, what looked like a signal scanner, a police band receiver, and partially didn't. A kitchen area that had clearly been used recently, a narrow door that probably led to a bathroom, a window with the blind drawn. No bed, which meant this wasn't where he lived. It was where he worked. I stood in the middle of the room and looked around carefully. Filed everything. How long have you had this? Since I took the contract. He locked the door behind us and set his jacket on the back of a chair. Without the coat, he looked different, less architectural, more human. The lines of him less deliberate. I rent it month to month. Building manager doesn't ask questions. Of course he doesn't. I set my bag down, moved to the work table, and looked at the equipment without touching it. Is this how you've been watching me? Remote. Partially. He came to stand beside me at the table, close enough that I was aware of the warmth of him, which was new and inconvenient. The early weeks were primarily physical surveillance. The equipment came later, when I wanted a way to monitor without being present. A brief pause. Without being seen looking. I looked at him sideways. Because being seen looking was becoming a problem. He didn't answer that. He reached past me and opened the laptop, pulling up a document I recognized as the kind of operational brief that private contractors used, stripped down, coded in places, the identifying information layered under enough professional language to be deniable. He turned it toward me. I read it. It took me 4 minutes. I read the whole thing twice, the way I approach a complex audio file. First pass for the overall shape, second pass for the detail. By the end of the second pass, I had a very clear picture, and the picture was significantly worse than I had allowed myself to construct in the coffee shop. Marcus Hale wasn't monitoring me as a precaution. He was looking for something specific. A set of audio files, recordings I had made during the last 6 months of my prior work, recordings that I had not known at the time were capturing what they were capturing, because the conversations I had been asked to document had not been fully explained to me. I was the sound person. I was handed coordinates and equipment specifications and told to do my job and not ask about context. I had done my job very well. And apparently what I had captured, inadvertently, in the professional execution of work I had since tried very hard to distance myself from, was enough to be genuinely dangerous to several people with significant resources and zero compunction about how they protected themselves. The brief named 3 individuals besides Hale. I recognized 2 of the names. One of them was currently a mid-level city official. One of them ran a private logistics company whose contracts I occasionally saw referenced in industry news. The third name I didn't recognize, which meant either they were new to this network or they were careful enough to have stayed out of anything I'd ever touched. I straightened up. He thinks I kept the recordings. Yes. And if he finds them? Elias looked at me steadily. The brief doesn't address that outcome specifically. He paused, which in my experience means the outcome is understood by all parties and doesn't need to be written down. I nodded slowly. And if he doesn't find them? If the search comes up empty? Same outcome, Elias said. Different timeline. The room was quiet around us. The signal scanner on the table emitted a faint periodic tone that I cataloged automatically. Steady, no variance, nothing active on the frequencies it was monitoring. Somewhere above us, the building groaned in the wind. I stood in the middle of a room I hadn't known existed 40 minutes ago, holding the knowledge that Marcus Hale had effectively decided on an ending for me regardless of what I produced, and felt the dark part of myself go very, very quiet. Not afraid quiet. Thinking quiet. The kind of silence I build before the sound arrives. The recordings exist, I said. Elias went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. They're not where he'd look, I continued. I didn't keep them in any format or location that connects to my name or my equipment. I kept them because I stopped. Chose the honest version. Because I knew, even then, that I might need them. That the work wasn't clean, and that clean people don't get to just walk away from unclean work without something to walk away with. Insurance, Elias said. Leverage, I corrected. I just didn't know I'd ever have to use it. He was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not the patient cataloging look, not the almost smile. Something more layered. Reassessment, I thought. And underneath it something that might have been the particular quality of recognition that comes from seeing yourself in someone else. Someone you thought was different from you turning out to be built from some of the same materials. Where are they? He asked. I looked at him. That's the question, isn't it? Noah, I need to think about the answer, I said. Not a deflection, a truth. Because the fireproof box at the back of my closet was one thing, but giving Elias the coordinates to it was another, and I was standing in his workspace looking at his operational brief for a contract that had my name at the top, and trust is an assessment and not a feeling. And I had made my assessment, but I was also someone who had learned the hard way that intelligence without caution is just recklessness with better vocabulary. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and I felt the specific relief of being understood without having to explain myself. All right, he said. Then let's talk about what happens in the next 72 hours before it becomes irrelevant. The plan we built over the next hour was not elegant. Elegant plans require time and controlled conditions, and we had neither. What we had was a week at most, probably less, before the second watcher escalated his brief and brought in additional resources. What we had was a set of recordings that were currently protected only by their obscurity. What we had was Elias's knowledge of how Hale operated, and my knowledge of what the recordings contained and who they implicated, and the combined weight of both of those things pressed against a timeline that was already burning at one end. Elias worked at the table while we talked, pulling information from sources I didn't ask too much about, building a picture of the second watcher. His name apparently was Brennan, mid-40s, former private military, the kind of professional who was good at waiting and not much troubled by what he was asked to do after the waiting was done. Elias talked about him with the flat precision of someone describing a weather system. Factual, unemotional. I watched Elias's hands move over the keyboard and thought about all the things those hands had probably done that he'd told me nothing about yet, and felt no fear about it, only the steady pull of wanting to know. The shape of the plan was this. We needed to move the recordings before Brennan escalated. Moving them meant me going back to my apartment, which was presumably being watched, and retrieving them without triggering anything. Once we had them, we had options. Without them, we were operating in a timeline controlled entirely by Hale. There's a window, Elias said. Brennan breaks surveillance for approximately 90 minutes each afternoon. I've tracked it 3 days running. 2 to 3:30. He goes somewhere in the northeast part of the neighborhood, consistent each day. You've been tracking his pattern. I've been tracking everything relevant to keeping you safe, he said, flatly, without decoration. Then he seemed to hear how it landed and looked up from the screen briefly. Since 3 weeks ago. I held that. Set it somewhere careful. The afternoon window today, if you're ready. I've been ready since Monday night, I said, which was true and also more than I'd planned to give him. But we were past the point of careful rationing. Something shifted in his expression again. That brief surface break, the person underneath briefly visible. He looked back at his screen. I'll be outside. There's a frequency. He reached into the equipment on the table and handed me a small earpiece, standard issue, the kind I'd used in a professional context before and handled with the casualness of someone for whom it wasn't unfamiliar. He registered that without comment. Channel 3. If anything changes, I'll tell you. And if Brennan comes back early? He won't. If he does. Elias looked at me. Then we deal with it. At 2:08, I walked into my building like I always walked into my building. Unhurried. Keys in hand. I nodded at the woman from the 4th floor who was coming down as I was going up, which I did every time I saw her because I had been building the texture of a normal life here for 4 years, and normal people nod at their neighbors. The elevator. My floor. My door. Inside, my apartment was exactly as I'd left it. High ceilings, amber afternoon light, the low hum of the heating system. I stood in the entryway for a moment and let myself feel it. The particular quality of a life that had been quietly dismantled from the outside without knowing it. All the small objects and routines and carefully chosen acoustics of a space I had built to feel safe, now understood to have been permeable the whole time. I didn't waste long on that. Bedroom. Closet. The back corner, behind a row of equipment cases I'd accumulated over years of field work. The fireproof box was exactly where I'd left it, small, gray, combination locked, innocuous enough to be overlooked in any cursory search because it looked like the kind of box a person keeps important documents in. Passport, financial records. Nothing interesting. I crouched down and worked the combination. 3714, my mother's birthday, which was the only piece of sentimentality I'd let myself keep in something that was otherwise entirely pragmatic. The box held what it had always held: two small hard drives, a single USB drive, and a folded piece of paper with a handwritten list that was not the recordings themselves, but a precise log of their contents: dates, locations, durations, the names of every voice I had identified. For years old, slightly creased along the fold lines, but intact. I stared at it all for a moment. This small, contained thing that had been sitting quietly in the back of my closet while I built a life on top of it. This evidence that the version of me I'd tried to leave behind had been careful enough to protect himself even then, even at 24, even while walking away from something he didn't fully understand the scale of. I took the drives and the USB and the paper, repacked the box with what was left, the actual documents, undisturbed, and replaced it in its corner. Then I stood up, put the retrieved items in the interior pocket of my jacket, and pressed them flat against my ribs with one hand for just a moment. There you are, I thought. I didn't know I was still looking for you. Then I walked back out. The lobby, the street, the gray October afternoon, cold and specific and real. Elias was half a block south, leaning against a building front with his hands in his pockets, looking at his phone with the practiced vacancy of someone who is not watching anything at all. I walked past him and turned the corner, and he fell into step beside me 40 seconds later, and I felt his presence beside me the way I feel a sound come into a mix, the whole thing shifting to accommodate it, the balance changing, everything finding a new center. You got them, he said. Not a question. Yes. He didn't ask to see them. I noted that. The deliberate space he left around the decision, around my agency in it, and set it next to all the other pieces of him I had been collecting. We walked for 2 blocks, and then his hand closed around my arm. Light, careful, stopping me at the edge of a building. I turned to look at him and found him already looking past me, expression closed down into that flat operational stillness. Brennan, he said quietly. Northeast corner. He came back early. I turned my head slowly. The man on the corner was not someone I recognized, but I understood immediately what I was looking at, the particular quality of presence of someone who is working at appearing absent. The studied casualness. The eyes that weren't looking at anything specific because they were looking at everything. He was looking in our direction. Did he make us? I said. Unknown. Elias's hand was still on my arm. Don't look at him again. I know, I said. I know how this works. He turned to look at me then, sharply, briefly, recalibrating something behind his eyes. Then he made a decision I could see him make, his posture shifting in some almost imperceptible way, and he stepped closer and said very quietly, "Walk with me." Close. Like we know each other. We do know each other. Like it's uncomplicated, he clarified. I looked up at him. Can you do uncomplicated? The ghost of something crossed his face. He lifted his hand from my arm to the back of my shoulder instead, steady, deliberate, warm through the fabric of my jacket, and we turned and walked back the way we came, 2 people moving through an October afternoon like it was simple, like the world wasn't tilting on the axis of a set of hard drives pressed against my ribs. I was acutely, completely aware of his hand the entire time. We turned another corner, then another. When we were clear, he dropped his hand, and I felt its absence like a frequency cut from a mix, sudden and specific. He'll report that I had contact with you, Elias said. His voice was back to its usual flatness, but something in it was slightly changed, like a track with a new layer underneath. How long before Hale responds to that? Hours, he said. Not days. I absorbed that. Looked at the city around us, gray and cold and carrying on, indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted from manageable to urgent. Then we move tonight, I said. Elias looked at me. Wind moved through the street, lifting the collar of his jacket, and for a moment, just a moment, the control slipped entirely, and I saw the full weight of what he was carrying. The exhaustion of it. The specific loneliness of a man who had spent too long moving through the world as a function rather than a person, and had made the mistake of sitting in a corner and watching someone who made him remember what it was like to be seen. Tonight, he confirmed. And something between us, that thing that had been building for 5 weeks in coffee shop corners and careful conversations and plain truths offered without apology, compressed itself into the space of a single look. Real and present, and very much not uncomplicated. I held his gaze. Okay, I said. He knew my name before I ever told him. We went back to his workspace. Not directly. Elias walked us through a route that added 12 minutes and 3 unnecessary turns. And I didn't ask questions because I understood the logic and because the 12 minutes gave me somewhere to put the adrenaline that had been running clean and cold through my system since the moment I'd seen Brennan on that corner. By the time Elias unlocked the narrow door and we stepped inside, I had it mostly managed, filed down into something I could work with. He locked the door, checked the signal scanner, moved to the window and adjusted the blind by a precise half-inch, looking through the gap before letting it fall back. Standard checks. The muscle memory of someone who has done this enough times that caution has become indistinguishable from habit. I took the drives and the USB out of my jacket and set them on the work table. We both looked at them for a moment. Small and gray and ordinary looking, the way the most consequential things often are. I need to know what we're working with, Elias said. I know. I reached for the laptop. Do you have an adapter, micro USB, older format? He opened a drawer and produced one without searching for it, which told me he'd already anticipated this, possibly days ago. I plugged in the first drive and sat down, and Elias pulled up a second chair, and we went through it together. It took 2 hours. The recordings were exactly as I remembered them, and considerably worse now that I had 4 more years of context to hear them through. I had been 24, technically skilled, deliberately incurious. I had placed the equipment, run the sessions, produced clean audio, and handed everything over without fully processing what the conversations contained. Now I processed them completely. Names, figures, dates. The particular cadence of men who believe their comfort makes them untouchable, discussing things that would destroy that comfort if they ever reached the right ears. Elias listened without expression. Occasionally he'd reach past me and mark a timestamp, or write something brief in the notepad he'd produced from somewhere. His handwriting was small and precise, the letters leaning slightly left. I noticed this the way I notice everything, automatically and without deciding to. By the end of the second hour, I had a complete map of what we were holding. Elias had 3 pages of notes. This is enough, he said. Not excited about it. Measuring it, the way a doctor measures something clinical. For multiple cases. If it reached the right investigators, several of these conversations alone would be. I know what they are, I said. He looked at me. Is that what you want to do with them? Is that an option? It's an option that comes with significant complications, as opposed to our current situation, which is completely uncomplicated. The ghost of a smile. He looked back at his notes. There are people I know, former contacts, not contractors. Investigators. Journalists with specific areas of focus who know how to handle sourced material without exposing the source. A pause. It would take time to set up correctly. Time we may not have. What's the other option? We use them as they were intended, he said. As leverage. Direct communication to Hale. Proof of existence. Proof that copies are distributed and will surface automatically if anything happens to either of us. A dead man's switch. Yes. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling, the exposed pipes, the high plaster, the light fixture that buzzed at a frequency I'd clocked when we first walked in and had been filtering out ever since. I thought about Marcus Hale, whom I had met exactly 4 times and understood completely. A man who measured everything in terms of risk management, who would look at a dead man's switch and calculate whether the exposure risk of the recordings outweighed the risk of leaving us operational. He won't accept it, I said. Not permanently. He'll agree to it, and then wait and find a cleaner angle. I know. So the leverage buys us time, not safety. Yes. Then the real answer is the investigators. I looked at Elias. We get the recordings to the right people, and we make ourselves irrelevant. If the recordings are already in motion, already in the hands of someone who can use them, then we stop being the variable he needs to manage. Elias was quiet for a moment. That process, building the chain of custody, finding the right contact, transferring the material securely enough that it doesn't get buried or intercepted, that's not tonight's work. No, I agreed. Tonight we need to not be findable. I paused, which means I can't go back to my apartment. The statement landed in the room and sat there. I watched Elias absorb it, watched something move through his expression that was carefully managed but not quite managed enough. He looked at the narrow door at the back of the room. There's a cot, he said. Through there? It's not. It's fine, I said. He looked at me. Noah. Elias. I held his gaze. I've been building a quiet life in a city I moved specifically to disappear. I have been watching a man watch me for 5 weeks and feeling, the entire time, like something I'd been waiting for had finally arrived. My apartment is a room I sleep in. This, I gestured at the room around us, the work table, the scanner, the evidence of a life lived in operational mode, is closer to what I actually am than anything in that apartment. He was very still. I'm not saying that to be romantic. I continued, because honesty felt like the only language that worked between us, and I wasn't willing to let it soften into something unclear. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that I'm not a civilian who stumbled into something. I know what I walked into. I know what I'm choosing. So don't apologize for the cot. Something broke open in his face. Just briefly. That complete surfacing of the person underneath, unguarded and real and lit with something I had been observing the shape of for weeks without being willing to name it directly. He was looking at me like I was something he had been holding his breath around for a very long time, afraid that breathing would disturb it. Then it was covered again. Not gone, just recontained, the way you turn a monitor down when something is loud enough to distort. All right, he said quietly. We worked through the evening. Elias made calls I half heard from across the room, brief, in language that was partly coded and partly technical, to people who answered quickly and didn't ask for explanations. He was building something, I understood, an architecture of communication and distribution around the recordings, laying the groundwork for a handoff that wouldn't happen tonight, but needed to be prepositioned. I worked in parallel on his laptop with credentials he handed over without hesitation, which cost him something because those credentials were the kind you didn't share, and the not hesitating was its own form of statement. At some point he made food. Simple things from a kitchen that was stocked like someone had planned for being here for a while. Bread, soup from a tin, coffee that was better than I expected. We ate at the work table because there was nowhere else to eat. The drives and the notepad pushed to one side. And it was such an ordinary domestic thing inside such an extraordinary situation that I had a moment of dissociation that manifested as a strange, helpless one, a laugh. What? Elias said. Nothing. I looked at him across the table. This is the strangest dinner I've ever had. He considered that seriously. I've had stranger. I believe you. We looked at each other, and the thing between us expanded slightly in the warmth of the room and the lateness of the hour and the specific intimacy of people who have spent an entire day in controlled crisis together. And then we both looked back at our food with the mutual understanding of people who are saving something for when they can afford it. It was close to midnight when his phone lit up. I was on the cot, not sleeping, lying in the dark listening to the room, the scanner's periodic tone, the distant city outside, when I heard him go still in the particular way of someone who has received information that changes the calculation. I got up. He was standing at the work table with his phone in his hand, face closed down in a way I hadn't seen since the early weeks. The operational flatness, stripped of the warmth the evening had built into it. He looked up when I came through the door and said, "They went to your apartment." My stomach dropped. Brennan, and at least one other. Building manager's access records show entry at 11:40. He set the phone down. They were looking for the recordings. They won't find them. The box is still there. It looks intact. They weren't only looking for the recordings. He said it carefully, the way he said things when he was managing the delivery. I went very still. What else? There was a contact listed in your apartment. A physical address. I assume someone you trusted, someone connected to your regular life. He paused. Brennan ran the address in real time. My contact at the building has eyes on the security feed. Another pause, shorter and heavier. They sent someone there too. The room narrowed. I crossed to the table in 3 steps. Who was at the address? What address did they? And then I knew. Because there was only one physical address I kept written down anywhere in my apartment, in a small notebook in my kitchen drawer, in handwriting so familiar I could reconstruct it from memory right now without trying. My mother's address in Seattle. Not her home. She'd moved last year into a smaller place. But her previous address, the one I had written down before the move and not replaced because I didn't write addresses on my phone, I wrote them by hand. The habit of someone trained in old operational security was still in that notebook. My mother's old address. But she received mail forwarded there still. Her name was still associated with it. A thorough person, looking for leverage, would find her. Has anyone reached her? My voice came out level. I was very focused on keeping it level. I don't know yet. Elias was already on his phone again. I'm getting confirmation. I stood at the edge of the work table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed the way I breathe when I'm working, carefully, in sequence, managing the system so the system can manage the problem. The dark part of me was not calm. It had gone to a place beyond the steady surgical precision of the afternoon, somewhere colder and more absolute. The place where gentleness becomes entirely inaccessible. Elias talked in low, rapid sentences for 90 seconds. Then he ended the call and looked at me. "She's fine," he said immediately. She wasn't at the address. Nobody reached her. The pressure in my chest released by approximately half. "You're certain?" My contact confirmed no activity at the location after the address was run. Whoever they sent pulled back, possibly because the address flagged as outdated, possibly because Hale drew a line at that particular escalation. He paused. For now. I stood with that. 2 words that contained everything. The temporary nature of safety, the permanent nature of what had just been demonstrated. That Marcus Hale was willing to reach toward my mother. That he had looked at the architecture of my quiet life and identified what I cared about and had considered, clinically and without sentiment, whether to put his hand on it. My mother, who called me every Sunday, who sent me photographs of her garden in Seattle in the summer, who said I was too quiet for a person and meant it with nothing but love. I breathed in, out, found the cold place and stayed in it. He crossed a line. I said, yes. The leverage approach. I stopped. Rerouted. Even if we get the recordings to investigators. Even if we make ourselves irrelevant. He knows about her now. That doesn't go away. No, Elias said. He said it without softening it. It doesn't. I looked at him. Then we need to do more than make ourselves irrelevant. We need to make him stop. Permanently stop. Yes. He held my gaze, and I could see him recalibrate. Not the plan, but me. The version of me standing in front of him now, which was different from the version that had arrived at his door this morning. He was looking at the thing I kept folded and tucked away, which had now unfolded completely and was standing quietly in full view with its hands flat on the table and its eyes open. There are ways to do that, he said carefully. Some of them are clean. Some of them are not. I know. You'd be choosing something you can't undo. He reached toward my mother, Elias. The words sat between us. He looked at me for a long time. That full, complete looking that had started this whole thing, across a coffee shop, before he knew I would look back. He was looking at me now with something I understood was a form of love, though neither of us was anywhere near that word out loud, because it was too large, and we were too careful, and we were also, still, in the middle of something that hadn't finished arriving yet. "All right," he said. "All right," I said back. And something shifted irrevocably between us. Not just the plan, us. The thing we'd been holding carefully at arm's length, rationing like something rare, chose this moment of all possible moments to stop being containable. He moved, and I moved, and the distance between us, which had been 20 feet for 5 weeks and 3 feet for 5 weeks before that, and approximately 8 inches for the last 12 hours, closed to nothing. He put his hands on either side of my face and looked at me for a moment that was both very brief and long enough to hold an entire conversation without words. Then his forehead came down to rest against mine, and we stood like that in the middle of his workspace at midnight with the scanner ticking and the city outside and the drives on the table containing enough destruction to dismantle several comfortable lives. Neither of us moved for a long time. "I need you to stay safe," he said, quietly, against my forehead. "Whatever we do next. I need that." The thing in my chest that had been cold and absolute since his phone lit up warmed by a degree. "Just one. Carefully. Then keep up," I said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. The realest sound I'd heard from him yet. Later, much later, the city outside pressing toward 2 a.m., and the work table covered in a new set of plans. I sat on the cot in the back room while Elias made his last calls of the night, and I called my mother in Seattle. It was too late to call. She answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep, immediately alert the way mothers become when their children call at wrong hours. "Noah? What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said. And then, because I was done being gentle with things that needed to be real, "I need you to do something for me. Don't ask questions tonight. I'll explain everything soon. But I need you to go stay with Aunt Mira for a few days." Silence. My mother was sharp in the way that quiet people are sharp. She heard undertones, read silences, understood that some requests contain entire explanations within them if you listen for the shape. "How many days?" she said. "A week. Maybe less." Another silence. "Are you safe?" I looked through the open door at Elias, his back to me, his voice low on the phone, the careful, deliberate economy of a man I had known for 5 weeks and understood more completely than people I had known for years. "I'm not alone," I said. She heard what that meant. I knew she did. She said, "I'll call Mira in the morning." And then, softer, "You're too quiet for a person, my son. But I think you've always been listening for something specific." My throat tightened. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Noah." I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand after the call ended. The city hummed outside. The scanner ticked. In the other room, Elias finished his call, and the workspace went quiet, and I heard him set his phone on the table and then just stand there. The sound of a man at the end of a very long day, in a room that had become something different from what it started as, deciding what to do with that. Something precious had already been lost tonight. Not my mother. She was safe, would be safer still by morning. But the version of my life I had built and tended and pressed myself into for 4 years, the quiet amber-lit existence I had constructed over the top of everything I'd tried to leave behind, that was gone. The address in the notebook, the coffee shop corner, the high ceilings, and the carefully chosen acoustics of an apartment, I would not be going back to the same way. That man was not who was going to walk out the other side of this. I knew it with the same certainty I know when a sound design is finished, not when it's perfect, but when it's true. When it has become what it needed to become, and further revision would only be avoidance. I set my phone down, lay back on the cot, listened to the city and the scanner and the particular silence of a space that contained Elias, and felt, underneath the loss and the cold calculation and the very real danger of the next 72 hours, the strange and specific piece of someone who has stopped pretending to be smaller than they are. Together, but something lost forever. I had known it was coming since before I could name it. Maybe since the first morning I sat in my corner and felt, looking at a stranger across a coffee shop, not afraid, but found. The cost of staying was this. The person I had been when I walked in was not the person who remained. I closed my eyes. In the other room, Elias moved quietly in the dark. He knew my name before I ever told him. I didn't sleep so much as drift. The cot was narrow and the room was cold at the edges, and the city outside pressed its ambient noise through the walls in a low, continuous murmur that I tracked without meaning to. A car, a distant siren, rain beginning sometime around 3 a.m., soft and specific against the window glass. I lay in the dark and let my mind do what it does when I stop directing it, which is organize, sort and file and arrange the available information into structures I can navigate. By the time gray light began pressing under the blind, I had a complete map of what we needed to do and in what order and what each step was likely to cost. I got up, found the bathroom through the narrow door, small, functional, a shelf with basics that suggested Elias had been living out of this space more than I'd initially understood. I borrowed what I needed without sentiment, splashed cold water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. The face that looked back was mine, and also not quite mine. Same features, something different behind them. The way a room sounds different after you move the furniture, same dimensions, altered acoustics. I went through to the workspace. Elias was already at the table. I didn't know if he'd slept at all. He was dressed, coffee made, 2 cups, one positioned at the edge of the table facing the chair he'd left pulled out slightly. A small, wordless thing that I received without drawing attention to it. I sat down and wrapped my hands around the cup, and we looked at each other across the morning. "How do you want to do this?" he said. "Tell me the contact," I said. "The journalist. The one you said knew how to handle sourced material." He reached for his notepad. "Her name is Caroline Rice. She writes for an investigative outlet based out of D.C. Independent, well-sourced. The kind of publication that has published things considerably more dangerous than this and has not been successfully pressured into silence." He paused. "I've worked adjacent to her before. Not directly. But I know she's careful, and I know she's been circling the logistics network that one of your recordings touches for approximately 2 years. Meaning she already has the frame. We'd be handing her the picture that goes in it. Yes. How long to reach her through a channel that doesn't expose us? I started building the channel last night." He turned the notepad to face me. A sequence of steps, each one a remove from the last. The architecture of a handoff designed to be untraceable back to its origin. 48 hours if everything holds. I studied it. Made 2 suggestions, both about the last stage of the chain. He listened, asked one question, and incorporated both without argument. That felt significant in a way I didn't examine too closely in the early morning light. "And Hale," I said, "while the handoff is in motion, we keep him looking at the leverage. He knows the recordings exist now. Brennan would have reported back that the search came up empty, which tells Hale they're not in the apartment. He'll assume they're with me or with you. As long as he believes the dead man's switch is the primary threat, he won't escalate until he finds a way around it. He'll be looking for the way around it. He'll be looking," Elias agreed. "But the 48 hours is manageable." Hale is cautious. He doesn't move until he's certain of the outcome. He moved on my apartment in 1 day. Because Brennan pushed the timeline by making contact with you. Hale was reacting. He looked at me steadily. He's reset now. He'll be slower. I absorbed that. Drank my coffee. The rain from the night before had left the city outside clean and slightly raw. I could hear it in the quality of the ambient sound, the particular resonance of wet streets and cold air. The workspace felt smaller in the daylight and more real, the accumulated evidence of the last 12 hours laid out on the table between us. The notepad, the drives, the empty cups, the whole complicated material record of 2 people deciding to trust each other. There's one more thing, I said. Elias waited. My mother's address. The notebook. I set my cup down. When this is over, when the recordings are placed and Hale is neutralized, I need to deal with the fact that he ran her address. That he considered it. I paused. I need to know he won't reconsider. Elias was quiet for a moment. I told you last night there were ways. Clean and not clean. The clean way ends with him in a position where the recordings are public, his associates are implicated, and moving against either of us becomes a liability rather than a solution. I looked at Elias. That's the clean way. Yes. Is there a reason we can't achieve that inside 48 hours? No, he said. There isn't. Something settled between us. Not comfort exactly. More like the particular quality of two people who have looked at a hard thing directly and decided together to walk toward it. I thought about the fact that a week ago I was sitting in this man's corner table watching him watch me across a coffee shop, and that the distance between that morning and this one was not measurable in days. All right, I said. Show me the rest of the plan. The next 40 hours moved in a rhythm I recognized from the kind of sound work I'd done under pressure. Long focused stretches broken by periods of necessary stillness, the whole thing accumulating toward a shape that didn't fully reveal itself until you were almost inside it. Elias worked the chain of communication with the meticulous patience of someone who understood that speed without precision was just noise. Each step confirmed before the next began, each contact verified, each handoff point stress-tested against the ways it could be intercepted. I worked alongside him, contributing what I had, a technical fluency with audio material and its chain of custody, an understanding of how the recordings would need to be contextualized for an investigative journalist who was rigorous about sourcing, and a handwritten log with its precise documentation of dates and voices and content, which turned out to be, as Elias put it, the most useful single document in the package. In between, we did the things that people do when they are existing in a shared space in concentrated proximity. We made food, took turns with the bathroom, argued briefly and productively about the second stage of the chain, defaulted to quiet when there was nothing that needed saying. I learned that Elias took his coffee without anything, that he read physical documents faster than digital ones, that he had a habit of pressing 2 fingers to his temple when he was working through something difficult that he wasn't aware he was doing. He learned, or confirmed, that I organized information by sound first and visual second, that I could maintain focus for hours without checking anything, that I didn't talk when I was thinking, and that the quality of my silences was legible to him in a way that I understood had been true since considerably earlier than either of us had acknowledged. On the second evening, when the chain was positioned and the handoff was scheduled for the following morning, he came and sat beside me on the cot, both of us with our backs against the wall, the narrow room holding us in its smallness, and told me about the not anymore. His family, what had happened to them, how it connected to the work he'd taken after, and why he'd kept taking it, and what it had gradually converted him into over years of doing things that required him to excise feeling from function. He told it plainly, the way he told everything. No performance of vulnerability, no shape of a confession designed to elicit a particular response. Just the facts of it, in sequence, with the weight they actually carried rather than the weight a person might strategically assign to them. I listened the way I listened to everything, fully, without interruption, tracking the layers underneath the surface. When he finished, I didn't offer consolation, because he hadn't asked for it, and it would have been a smaller thing than what the telling deserved. You've been running ever since, I said. Yes. And then you took a contract that put you in a corner watching someone who didn't run. He turned his head to look at me. Yes. And you couldn't figure out why you kept coming back. I could figure out why, he said. That was the problem. I held his gaze in the dim light of the back room. Outside, the rain had returned, steadier now, and the city beneath it was muffled and close, and there was nowhere I would rather have been than inside that small room with this broken man who had chosen truth over contract and stayed when he could have walked away. I reached over and took his hand. He looked down at it, then back at me. Then he turned his hand under mine and held it with a grip that was careful and very certain. And we sat with the rain and the city and 4 years of each other's accumulated damage, and didn't require it to be anything more complicated than what it was. The morning of the handoff, I called my mother. She was at Aunt Myra's, calm, asking no questions but listening to every layer of my voice the way she always had. I told her she could go home in a few days. She said she'd extended her stay voluntarily because Myra's garden in late October was surprisingly worth looking at. I laughed, real, surprised, the kind that comes from somewhere uncomplicated. And she said, "There you are," which was what she always said when I laughed like that. I told her I'd call Sunday. I ended the call and stood with the phone in my hand for a moment, feeling the specific texture of a love that had survived everything I'd put it through by being quiet and patient and consistent. The kind of love that doesn't require you to be better than you are to access it. I was keeping that. Whatever else was lost, whatever version of myself I'd left behind in a coffee shop corner, in a fireproof box, in an apartment I was not going back to, I was keeping that. The handoff completed at 11:22 a.m. Caroline Rice confirmed receipt through the chain at 11:47. Her response was 4 sentences, spare, professional, containing within its compressed language the particular quality of a person who has just received something they've been building toward for 2 years and is allowing themselves exactly 4 sentences of acknowledgement before getting to work. Elias read it twice, set the phone down, pressed 2 fingers to his temple. I watched him process the particular release of something he'd been carrying at operational tension for weeks. The careful, controlled breath of it, the brief surfacing of something underneath. "It's in motion," I said. "It's in motion," he confirmed. We looked at each other across the work table. The drives were wiped and disposed of. The notepad was burned. Literally, in the kitchen sink. Elias matter-of-fact about it in a way that told me he'd burned a great deal of paper in his life. The workspace looked like it had before we arrived, or close enough. We had been careful about what we left. I picked up my bag. I had almost nothing. What I'd come with, the stripped-down inventory of a night spent not at home. Elias had his jacket, his phone, 3 items I'd watched him pack with the efficiency of someone who had left places quickly before. "Where do we go?" I said. "Somewhere Hale isn't looking yet. I have a place." He paused. "It's not this. I didn't like this place anyway," I said. "The light fixture buzzes at 47 hertz. He looked at me. Then the almost smile completed itself, fully, for the second time, and I received it the way I always did, like something briefly and completely real pressing through the surface. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." We had been walking for 4 minutes when his phone buzzed. He checked it without breaking stride, glanced at the screen, and something in his step changed, almost imperceptible, the way a sound changes when a new frequency is introduced underneath it. Not the operational flatness of a threat being processed. Something different. Something I didn't have a category for yet because I hadn't seen it on him before. I looked at him. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. We walked another half block in the October cold, the city moving around us in its indifferent morning rhythm. Then he stopped. "Elias." He looked up from the phone. His face was arranged with care, the deliberate arrangement of someone who has decided how much to show before showing it. He looked at me with those pale gray eyes, and I saw, behind the management of his expression, something I had learned to read in the weeks of watching him. Not the patient cataloging. Not the almost smile. The other one. The one that looked like a door closing on a room he wasn't ready to show. "There's something I haven't told you," he said. The sentence landed in the cold air between us. I became very still. Not the voluntary stillness, the other kind. The body making decisions before the mind catches up. Because I knew, the way I know when a sound design has a flaw buried deep before I can locate it, before I can name the specific frequency. I knew that whatever was in his expression was not small, was not something that would resolve in a sentence and recede. How long have you not told me? I said. He held my gaze. Since before the coffee shop. The city continued around us. A woman walked past with a dog. Somewhere above us, a window opened and closed. The October cold pressed against my face, and the ordinary world carried on being ordinary. And I stood on a wet pavement in the aftermath of everything we had just survived together and felt the ground shift. Tell me, I said. He opened his mouth, and then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something moved through his face, swift, complex, the compressed passage of an emotion I hadn't seen on him before and couldn't immediately name. He looked up at me. The ringing continued between us. Who is it? I said. He turned the screen toward me. The name on the screen was not one I recognized, but the number underneath it, the country code, the specific sequence of digits, I recognized completely. Because I had spent 6 months of my life, for years ago, calling variations of that number, at the instruction of a man who had given me equipment and coordinates and told me not to ask about context. My whole body went quiet. Noah, he started. Don't, I said. The phone rang again. Insistent. The city pressed around us. I looked at Elias, this man I had chosen, this broken, careful man who had sat across a coffee shop for 5 weeks and given me plain truths in small, careful denominations, who had held my hand in a dark room while the rain came down and told me the weight of what he carried. And I watched him look back at me with an expression that was the most unguarded I had ever seen on him, which was how I knew it was bad. Because he was not managing it. He was letting me see it fully, the first time I had ever received his face without any management at all. And what I saw there was not guilt. It was something older and heavier and more complicated than guilt, something that had been sitting in him since before he ever walked into a corner coffee shop and chose my corner and waited. The phone rang a third time. You need to answer it, I said. My voice was even. I was very focused on keeping it even. Not until. Answer it, Elias. He looked at me for one more moment. Then he answered the call, brought the phone to his ear, and said nothing. Listened. His face did not move. He listened for approximately 20 seconds while I stood in front of him on a wet October pavement with the cold pressing against my skin and the whole architecture of the last 5 weeks rearranging itself around a number I recognized and a name I didn't. He lowered the phone. The call had ended. He stood with the phone at his side and looked at me with that completely unmanaged face, and I understood. I am someone who hears the thing inside the silence, who has always been able to locate the frequency that doesn't belong, who knows before they can name it when something is wrong in the sound design. I understood that the one thing he hadn't told me was not a small thing. It was the thing everything else had been built around. Say it, I said. Noah. My name in his mouth, plain and without apology, the way he had said it in a coffee shop for the first time on an October morning, as though it wasn't new information. As though it wasn't new information. Marcus Hale didn't hire me 8 weeks ago. The city, the rain-cleaned pavement, the ordinary morning. How long? I said. He breathed. 2 years. 2 years. 2 years before the coffee shop. 2 years before the corner table and the untouched cappuccino, and the first time he said my name and I didn't run. I had moved to this city 4 years ago. He had found me, or been pointed at me, 2 years after that. The entire geography of the life I thought I had built clean and quiet and free, the amber-lit apartment and the sound work and the careful solitude, had been surveilled for 2 years before he ever sat down in my corner. I looked at him. The man who had said yes to every uncomfortable truth without apology, who had told me I'm trying to understand your life like it was a reasonable project, who had held my face in his hands at midnight and said I need you to stay safe. 2 years, I said. Yes. And the original contract. Before Hale. Before 8 weeks ago. I heard my own voice from a slight distance, very level, operating from that cold, absolute place. Who gave you the original contract, Elias? He held my gaze, his face completely open, Everything visible, the full weight of what he had been carrying since before I knew he existed. He told me the name. The city continued. The morning continued. Somewhere a door opened and a child's voice carried briefly through the cold air and was swallowed by the urban noise and disappeared. I stood on the wet pavement and heard the name and felt the bottom of something give way. Not dramatically, not with noise, the way things give way in audio when the foundation frequency drops out and everything built on top of it falls through the silence that was always underneath. I had heard that name before. I had heard it on one of the recordings.